orders had been issued. The crew was prepped. The manifest signed, but one name was quietly moved to standby. Not grounded, not dismissed, just held back. Her clearance remained intact. Her gear was ready. Still, she was told to stay near the tarmac and let others handle the approach. Then came the wind shift. Then came the silence on the radio. That was when the pattern broke. When a voice not heard in months keyed the mic without waiting for approval. And in that moment, everything changed. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to hear more untold stories of extraordinary service and the heroes who walk among us, never asking for the recognition they deserve. The flight line was quiet that morning, but not still. Wind pushed in low from the eastern peaks, lifting the corners of canvas tarps and stirring grit across the concrete. The sky above the ridge was a hard, pale silver, veined with the motion of crosswinds that bent the clouds without breaking them. No one looked up. They were used to it by now. Crews moved between birds in practiced rhythm, stepping over cables, adjusting gear loads, cracking jokes into the sharp air. Mara stood beside Dust Line 3, a UH-60 Blackhawk with a matte hull dulled by altitude dust and winter burn. She had one hand on the fuselage, fingertips resting lightly against the seal just below the port side intake. Her eyes weren't on the aircraft. They were on the wind shadow, trailing off the far ridge, where the light bent slightly wrong. There were two directions of motion up there, not one. She didn't say it out loud. Behind her, a small group of crew chiefs clustered near a refueling rig. One of them, the lead pilot for this rotation, tossed his helmet into the open hatch with a casual arc and smirked as it thudded against the inside wall. That's my kind of head count. He said to no one in particular, just me, the patient, and whatever ridge Mara thinks is talking to her today. There was a round of polite laughter. The crew medic, already strapped in by the center bulkhead, didn't join. He gave Mara a nod as she passed, but didn't speak. That was the rhythm now. She was part of the aircraft, not hostile, not welcome, present. The nameplate on the manifest read, Dust Line 3. Mara's name was on the lower half. Second seat. No radio authority. No one questioned her credentials anymore. They just didn't call her for input. 2 years ago, during a night descent into unstable terrain, she had taken over from a senior pilot and landed without command approval. The aircraft came back in one piece. The paperwork did not. She clipped her flight gloves to the restraint strap on her seat and stepped back, adjusting the chin strap on her helmet with slow precision. Tucked behind her harness panel was a folded sheet of paper. The top edge had worn soft from years of use, but the ink still held wind, tunnel sketches, hand-drawn, mapping reversal pulses along 3 common pass routes in the eastern corridor. She hadn't shown it to anyone in months. The air was dry and thin, not cold, exactly, but full of sharpness that made the back of her throat ache when she breathed too deeply. The ridgeline ahead was visible in full from this angle. It looked close enough to touch. High white peaks curved around the western flank like the lip of a tilted bowl. The pass between them, narrow and glinting in the hard morning light, was where they were headed. The call came over comms with clipped syllables. Patient inbound, stable but fading, altitude challenge, no alternate access. Dust Line 3 launched in 6 minutes. The lead pilot swaggered up the ramp with his headset looped casually over one shoulder. He slapped the outer skin of the aircraft twice, like it was an old friend, then climbed in and buckled his harness with theatrical flair. Mara was already seated, her posture upright, her hands folded just above the trim controls. "Let's give the mountains a show," he said, grinning as the rotor spin-up began. Mara didn't respond. Her eyes were on the nav panel, then the altitude readout, then out the windshield again. She was counting something silently. Not seconds, not distance, something else. The med crew secured the rear. The patient would be loaded at altitude. Wind advisories had already started shifting toward red, but no official halt had been issued. That meant go. As the Black Hawk lifted off, the pitch of the rotors climbed fast. The lift was clean, but the slip pattern had already begun. Mara felt it in the right foot pedal, less resistance than normal. The crossdraft wasn't just climbing, it was circling. She noted it without comment. In the cockpit, the lead pilot chatted with bass. His voice was upbeat, confident, just loud enough to carry over internal channels. Dust line 3 en route, package retrieval window nominal, ridge drift is showing light. Mara scanned the data stream. Ridge drift was not light. It was cross-loaded. She watched a ripple shift on the outermost cloud layer and recalibrated her mental map of the pass. She kept both hands near the trim. The pilot had not noticed the side slip. Her gloves swung gently from the strap beside her thigh. The aircraft rose into colder air. The route ahead narrowed by degrees. The wind did not whistle or roar. It pulsed in waves. Mara listened without leaning forward. She knew this terrain. Not from satellite, not from briefings. From hours logged over silent flights that didn't make the board. She didn't need to guess what came next. She just needed to be ready, because it was already beginning, and no one else saw it yet. The bird climbed steadily, the ridgeline drawing closer with each passing minute. Inside the cockpit, the lead pilot kept his tone light as he called in altitude markers. He tapped the overhead panel twice, more out of habit than need, then glanced toward Mara without much interest. Her posture hadn't shifted. She remained centered, eyes moving between the altimeter and the wind trace overlay. There was a flutter on the secondary panel. He didn't notice it. 2 years earlier, in a room lined with weathered whiteboards and plastic chairs, Mara had tried to say something. It had been during a descent sim over the Karakoram Split, an exercise designed to test approach timing under fluctuating pressure drops. The commander on duty had insisted the glide path follow a digital trace logged during monsoon season. Mara flagged the variance in slope angle and recommended a modified arc. The instructor leaned back in his chair and smiled without warmth. He said her suggestions were noted, but unnecessary. When the exercise went live and the simulated bird started to yaw, she overcorrected on instinct and landed the rig. Clean. Safe. Uncommanded. The debrief that followed was quiet. Too quiet. Her performance score dropped into the gray zone. A week later, her seat assignment changed. Then her access badge was downgraded. Nobody said the word punished. They didn't have to. Her call sign disappeared from the official manifest by the end of the quarter. Now, with the snow ridge less than 10 clicks ahead and the pass narrowing to a bite-sized funnel, Mara adjusted the pressure offset manually. She didn't say anything. The numbers were all moving the wrong way. A cold updraft had already twisted the lower wind band into a shallow spiral. Classic prelude to a sheer pocket. She saw it on the telemetry and in the sky. The pilot kept talking. "Smooth ride so far," he said into the comms. "Might be our fastest lift and pull this month." Behind them, the medic leaned slightly into the cabin, speaking low. "Is it just me? Or does that ridge wind look tight?" Mara didn't answer at first. She knew the tone. It was a question dressed in camouflage, half a test, half a warning. "It's tighter than it looks," she said eventually, keeping her voice level. "Cross drafts angling in from the south face. We'll feel it at angle of descent." The lead pilot chuckled. "Appreciate the input, but the latest terrain packet says we're clear. New overlays came in at 0700. Mara blinked once. The overlays were from yesterday. She knew because she had updated them herself last night. Pencil and ruler. While the rest of the crew packed gear or caught sleep. Her notes had never been uploaded. She had taped one copy beside the nav display. It was gone when she boarded. Another flicker touched the corner of the instrument panel. Not a warning light, just a shimmer in the digit spread. Wind pressure variance between port and starboard was rising. Not enough to trip a full alarm. Just enough to matter. She adjusted trim pressure by half a point. Her gloves hung by her knee. She remembered walking out of the debrief room alone that night 2 years ago, the chalk residue still on her fingertips from the whiteboard. Her gloves were clipped to her belt. She had worn them in, thinking she'd fly again that evening. Instead, she sat on a bench near the flight line for an hour, staring at a row of tethered birds she would not touch again that month. In the present, the aircraft gave a slight hitch. Not a jolt, just the kind of sideways slink that comes before real wind moves. Mara eased her hand toward the stick. The pilot didn't notice. "You feel that?" the medic asked, shifting weight. "Head pressure pocket," Mara said. "It's forming below our vector. If it hits early, we'll yaw right." The pilot laughed again, not unkindly. "Relax. It's a standard corridor run. We've flown worse." Mara didn't argue. She just marked the offset silently in her mind. 5 degrees to the east, 1 second of lag, drop altitude by 100.0 feet and hug the wall on the lee side. The sky outside brightened slightly, but not from sun. That meant ice was forming somewhere over the crest. The reverse shear would follow. She glanced toward the torn page folded inside her vest. The hand-drawn map of air curls and pressure bands was creased from dozens of re-readings. She didn't pull it out. She didn't need to. The pilot made another light remark into the comms. Something about mountain air giving him good luck. The medic didn't respond this time. Mara tightened her harness by a quarter turn. Up ahead, the pass looked clear, but Mara saw the color in the sky shift a little too fast. The wind was circling beneath them now, gathering shape with no voice. It didn't shout when it moved. It whispered, and it was about to speak. The sky folded without warning. The Black Hawk lurched as the reverse shear struck the port side like an unseen wall. The frame dipped hard left, then snapped back as the air pocket collapsed beneath them. The pilot's hand jerked on the stick too late, caught between instinct and confusion. The rotor, wash, stuttered. The nose dropped 7 degrees in under 2 seconds. The medic slammed into the side wall, grabbing for a harness loop. The bird was no longer riding the pass. It was falling sideways into it. Mara's hands were already moving. She didn't speak. Didn't wait. She reached across and took control with the same motion she had practiced in silence 100 times on deadboard sims and undocumented drills. Her right hand found the stick. Her left adjusted the trim. She didn't ask. She didn't warn. She just flew. The lead pilot's mouth opened, but no words followed. His eyes stayed wide as the control panel blinked red across the bottom edge. Altitude alarms screamed. Velocity drift crossed the upper threshold. None of it mattered. Mara pulled the Black Hawk into a steep bank toward the southern flank, rotating nose down into the top of a shadowed ravine that didn't appear on the mission overlays. The descent path narrowed to a split line between cliff shadows and white sky. The nav map showed open terrain, but Mara had seen this channel before. 3 years ago, on a supply run logged without press or command. She'd watched the wind curl through that notch like breath through a straw. Now, it caught the blades like a net. The aircraft dipped below the ridgeline. The rotors bit into the thin air. Lateral thrust snapped wide for half a second, then corrected. The HUD flashed red again. Mara flipped the panel switch without hesitation and went raw. No overlays, no system assists, just instincts, hands, machine. Behind her, the medic had gone quiet. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was staring. The bird shook as another gust caught the tail boom. Mara shifted her boot on the left pedal, adjusted trim torque by feel, and realigned the angle of descent by 1.4 degrees. She had memorized that number months ago. Outside the window, the ravine narrowed. Rock edges pressed closer. Snow peeled off the walls like smoke, disturbed by rotor wash. The sky above had vanished. Only the cut remained. This chute wasn't part of the route. It was an erosion corridor, carved over decades by snowmelt and air spirals. No one had mapped it because no one thought to fly through it. Mara did. She dropped the bird lower, angling just above a frost shelf that shimmered gray in the diffused light. The crosswind reversed again, this time from the opposite direction. She was ready for it. Her grip adjusted with a slow flex. Not a jerk. It was like holding a conversation with the wind, one she had already played out in her head. Dozens of times. with paper sketches and mental rehearsals. Her gloves were on now, the same pair clipped beside her seat since pre-flight. The seams were worn where her fingers bent. She could feel the pressure shifts through them like touch. One of the side panels on her leg pocket had come loose, flapping slightly. The corner of the hand-drawn wind curve poked out. It wasn't the same as the official map. Her version had loops and spirals, not arrows, not grid lines, just memory. The Black Hawk dipped again. The pilot's hand twitched toward the controls, but he didn't take them. His voice stayed caught somewhere between protest and surrender. Mara didn't look at him. The last turn in the corridor was the tightest, less than 20 meters clearance between the walls. She rolled into it like water following gravity, letting the bird align itself with the invisible current she had already felt building from the west. The forward motion evened. The instruments caught up. The scream of the alarm dulled into a steady tone. No words were spoken in the cabin. The medic remained strapped in, eyes locked on the altimeter. The rest of the crew held still. Mara kept her breathing slow. Her hands moved only when necessary. No dramatic corrections, just readjustments. Soft, steady. The corridor began to widen. The sky lightened to a pale silver again. Below, a narrow snow shelf flattened into view. It wasn't on any chart, but Mara had seen it before, years ago, through binoculars on a long-forgotten recon lift. It had stayed with her like a line in a song. She guided the Black Hawk down, letting the skids touch just short of a small outcropping. The wind died around them like a held breath finally exhaled. Only then did she speak. "Skids stable. Load fast. We're not staying." The medic unclipped his harness. His hands shook once, then steadied. The lead pilot remained quiet. Above them, the wind moved on. The sky held. Snow slapped against the cockpit glass as the rotor blades beat the air back into shape. The ledge was narrow, tilted slightly toward the valley drop. But the skids held. Mara kept one hand on the controls, the other floating just above the engine monitor. Her posture never shifted. No visible tension. Only the exact angles required to keep the Black Hawk locked to the ground as the wind surged around them. Behind her, the medic crouched low, shoulders tense as he secured the stretcher and keyed the winch system. The injured soldier had been pulled from a collapsed outpost bunker along the southern ridge, spine stabilized and pulse dropping. Dust Line 3 was the only option left, but no one expected them to reach this shelf, especially not from the route they took. "Status," the medic called over his shoulder, still clipped into his belt loop. "Stable. 60 seconds," Mara answered. The pilot was still seated beside her, hands on his lap, eyes locked forward. He hadn't spoken since the bird touched down. His headset buzzed faintly with command channel static. Every few seconds, a sharp voice cut through the interference. "Abort. Abort. Dust Line 3. Respond. You are not on a cleared descent. Confirm position." Mara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her voice would only cause confusion. And this part of the airspace didn't belong to the base anymore. Not now. It belonged to the mountain and whoever could hear it. She watched the gauges for shift. Power was holding. Battery arc good. The cloud shelf above was beginning to move again, signaling a change in updraft. She counted quietly under her breath, marking seconds between pulses. It was almost time. The medic finished the load. The patient was strapped in, vitals stabilized. He climbed back into the cabin, breathing hard, and settled into the rear station. His helmet was fogged. He wiped it with his sleeve and looked forward. His voice came low, not questioning, but present. "That route you took, it's not on the charts." Mara kept her eyes forward. "I know." He didn't press further. He just nodded once, slow, and locked into his station without another word. The wind shifted. The edge of the shelf began to frost upward, ice forming faster now that the lower air was pulling away. That meant one thing. The draft was reversing again. If they didn't lift now, they wouldn't lift clean. Mara pulled power with one smooth breath. The rotors responded instantly. The aircraft rose vertical for 5 meters, then pivoted nose first into the blind corridor that traced the ridge wall like a scar. The HUD didn't show the path. It couldn't. The sensors saw only chaos. But Mara knew the shape of the descent. She had practiced it in silence for years, without approval, on paper, in thought, in motion. Below them, white void. Above, angled sky. She threaded the Black Hawk between both. Snow spun in wide arcs around the cockpit. Visibility dropped to 5 meters, then 2. The bird tilted 10 degrees left, adjusted by half a degree right, and rode the void downward like a thought made physical. Mara didn't blink. She didn't clench. She didn't ask for confirmation. In the rear cabin, no one moved. The corridor tightened. They weren't following terrain. They were riding weather. This path was formed by temperature disparity, sheer elevation shifts, and a precise memory of timing. If she rose too fast, they would hit the ceiling swell and stall. Too low, and the side wind would throw them off balance. But she had calculated for this. Not on a screen, not in a lab, in her body. The next bend came blind. She banked gently, leaning into the tilt without overcorrecting. The bird swung through the air like a branch bending in snow. The nose dipped at the exact moment the wind sloped beneath them, and they gained lift again without changing speed. The radio howled again. Dust line 3. Identify. You are in a dead zone. You are flying blind. She switched the radio off. The next moment was the hardest. The exit funnel had no warning. The wall of snow ended with open air and a sudden brightness that felt like breaking water. Mara pushed power to 78%, raised the nose by 4 degrees, and cleared the shelf with 12 meters to spare. The valley opened like a throat below them. The Black Hawk leveled. For a full 10 seconds, nothing moved. The cabin was silent. No words, no cheers, just the hum of systems and the quiet breath of those who had witnessed something they didn't know how to explain. Mara eased back the thrust, stabilized course, and locked heading. The clouds faded behind them. The medic leaned forward, voice quiet. Where did you learn that descent? Mara's eyes stayed forward. Same place I learned to listen. The rest of the flight was uneventful by comparison. They touched down on the main pad with less than 10 minutes variance. Medical crews rushed forward. The patient was lifted out. The fuel team approached. The command group stood nearby, brows furrowed, checking clipboards. No one looked at Mara. That was fine. She shut down the engine block herself. No ceremony. She walked down the ramp and looped her gloves through the panel hook. The wind had finally stopped moving. The sky above was clear. Somewhere in her leg pocket, the paper sketch of the wind route was still dry. She left it there. Mara powered down the Black Hawk without a word. The rotors slowed to a crawl, blades still gleaming with frost as they came to rest above the pad. Steam rose faintly from the skids where warm metal met snowmelt. She unbuckled her harness, unclipped her gloves from the panel hook, and stepped out onto the tarmac without waiting for the others. The wind had calmed now, just a low whisper along the edges of the concrete. A small group of ground crew approached with a stretcher team already en route. No one asked who flew. The lead pilot remained in his seat for a few extra seconds before standing. He adjusted his collar and straightened his vest like someone preparing for a photograph. By the time the medical team reached the ramp, he had a practiced calm in his posture. Mara walked past him, gloves tucked beneath her arm. She moved toward the far edge of the pad where the auxiliary carts were parked, still damp from the night's frost. One of the operations officers stepped forward, his voice pitched for clarity. Impressive work, Lieutenant. We didn't expect a clean return after that altitude alert. Bold flying. The pilot nodded once, eyes scanning the ground crew as they began lifting the wounded soldier onto the transport gurney. He said nothing specific, just let the compliment land. Another officer stepped in. That descent path was flagged as non-operational. How did you stabilize? The pilot's voice was level. Improvised off the terrain, he said, trusted the ridge flow. There was a pause. A few nodded. One chuckled. Still breathing. So we'll call it genius. The group laughed lightly. None of them looked toward Mara, who was standing by the gear crate, unrolling a fresh marker wrap for the blade caps. She wiped condensation off the tracking sheet with one gloved hand, then reached for the flight log strapped inside the crate's weather shield. The wind data on the official readout was incomplete, so she flipped to her own notes and penciled in the adjustments. Humidity swing at elevation was sharper than forecast. Crossflow bend came 10 seconds earlier than the model suggested. Total trim offset 1.8 degrees. She underlined the number, then tucked the sheet back into the metal clipboard and snapped the band shut. Behind her, footsteps approached. The medic from the flight stopped a few paces back, his voice low but even. "That wasn't luck," he said. Mara didn't turn. He waited, then added, "They don't know what they're congratulating." Still, she said nothing. Instead, she adjusted the turbine access panel latch, ran one hand across the housing to check for frost fracture, and moved on to the next item. The medic stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Inside the control building, a group had already gathered around the debrief screen. The mission clock showed their full route, but the descent data was patchy. No telemetry overlay had tracked their actual corridor. The system marked it as blank airspace. One of the junior technicians tilted his head at the trace, frowning. "That can't be right," he said. "They flew through a dead zone." An officer shook his head. "Must be a glitch. They must have skirted the shelf and flanked in from the west." A second voice added, "There's no protocol for that descent. It's not in the maneuver bank." The tech leaned closer to the screen. "It's not in the system," he said, "but someone flew it." Back on the pad, Mara had begun her post-flight inspection. She moved with quiet precision, every motion purposeful. When she opened the nav sleeve, she found the flight card still unsigned. As usual, beneath it, the edge of her folded wind sketch was just visible. The corner had curled from contact with the cold. She adjusted it gently, slid it back into its place, and zipped the panel closed. A young tech hovered nearby, holding a wrench set. He had been sent out to assist, but hadn't spoken yet. His eyes lingered a moment too long on the sleeve flap. He had seen the edge of the paper, had noticed that the route they had flown was drawn in her own hand, not issued from the top. He didn't say anything, just stepped forward and handed her the tools. She took them without a word. Inside the command tent, the lead pilot stood by the screen, watching the playback on loop. His name was in the header, his voice on the comms. No mention of who took the stick, no correction offered. A flight lead patted him on the back. "You just made it onto the short list." The pilot smiled faintly. He didn't agree, but he didn't disagree either. Mara stayed on the pad until the sun reached its peak. The wind never rose again. She logged rotor wear, cabin temperature swing, and trim response with the same exact handwriting she had used since flight school. Then she walked the line of the aircraft from nose to tail and checked every latch, every seal. She did not go inside for the debrief. She wasn't expected. By the time the final ground crew cleared out, the pad was nearly empty. The junior tech who had seen her sketch stood near the tool crate, watching her as she locked the last panel. He started to say something, then stopped. Mara gave him a brief nod and turned toward the hangar. Her name would not appear in the mission record, but the data would hold, and the air knew. The playback room was colder than usual. A low hum came from the central console where a trio of instructors huddled around the screen. The mission replay looped for the third time, the same moment flashing across each monitor the shift in control during the descent. The deviation from protocol. The correction angle that should not have been possible on raw input alone. One instructor leaned forward, squinting. "Run the stick telemetry again," he said. The tech nodded, brought up the overlay. 2 lines flickered into view. One was flat, barely reactive. The other danced with perfect rhythm, trailing the descent through the blind corridor with surgical timing. "That control input," the instructor said slowly. "That isn't him." Another instructor stepped closer. He tapped the screen where the pattern started. "Look at the handoff," he said. "No transition delay. Someone else took the stick. Right here." A pause passed between them. Then the third instructor crossed his arms. "Verify print logs, now." The tech ran the input sequence. 10 seconds later, a new file populated across the center monitor. Pilot fingerprint mismatch, co-pilot override, manual stick control logged from the left seat at timestamp 0739. The room went still. The instructor who had spoken first turned toward the glass wall, where the outer airfield shimmered with morning heat. He didn't look surprised, just quiet. Who was flying that bird? No one answered. Outside, Mara moved slowly along the edge of the hangar. The air was dry and clean, sunlight bending through the dust that lifted from the tire track grooves near the refuel station. She wore her flight gloves again, not because it was cold, but because she was rewiring the auxiliary pressure line on the port wing cradle. Her fingers worked without hesitation, the motion smooth and unhurried. A few meters away, a new face lingered, young, fresh boots, flight vest not yet weathered. The trainee waited just outside the line of equipment, eyes on her but posture careful. After a few seconds, he stepped forward. "They told me to ask you about Ridge 11. Mara didn't turn immediately. She finished the hose clamp, checked the seal with one gloved thumb, then set the tool back on the crate lid. Her hair was pulled tight under the cap, the edges darkened slightly by the morning's work. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. The trainee stood still. "They said you flew it," he added, his voice lower now, that no one else could have made that descent. Mara reached into her vest and pulled out the weather log. The map inside had been folded and refolded so many times it now opened along its creases without guidance. At the bottom corner, pinned in place with a small strip of tape, was the hand-drawn overlay of Ridge 11. Not digital, not labeled, just lines and currents and altitude bands marked with human instinct. She placed it on the crate between them. The trainee leaned in. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed the ridgeline tracing, the narrow funnel path, the curl in the air just beyond the ledge where no official route existed. Mara tapped one point with her gloved finger. "That's where it turns," she said. "If you see the wind shift through this notch here, you don't correct. You let it carry." The trainee frowned. "It doesn't show that on the flight model." She nodded once. "I know." In the distance, an engine spun up, another crew prepping for a routine lift. Voices carried across the ramp, casual and unaware. The world hadn't changed. Not yet. Inside the command building, the instructors stood around the screen in silence. One of them finally spoke. "Did anyone ever log her flight status reinstatement?" The answer was no. Another said, "We didn't even authorize that path. She just flew it." "Perfectly," someone added. No one disagreed. Back on the field, Mara rolled the chart back into place, clipped it under the elastic band inside her flight log, and sealed the cover. She handed the logbook to the trainee. "Take it. Study the topography. You won't see this route on any overlay." The trainee took it carefully, both hands steady. "Will you teach it?" he asked. Mara looked out toward the peaks, now hazy under the rising sun. She didn't smile, but her voice was steady. "I'll show it once." He nodded. As he turned to go, she returned to her work without a word. The dust lifted again across the pad. Somewhere in the control room, the question was still echoing, soft and unresolved. Who was flying? But down here, under the wing, among the ropes and cables and silent things that held everything together, the answer had already settled into place. You just witnessed the story of someone who never asked to be seen, yet changed everything the moment it mattered. Denied the title, overlooked in the room. She held her ground with calm, practiced hands. Her strength was not in commands or accolades, but in the quiet certainty of knowing what needed to be done, and doing it with precision when no one else could. This was not a story of revenge or redemption. It was one of presence, of self-worth, untied from rank, of a woman who led without asking permission and let her actions speak in the language of wind and flight. If her story made you pause, reflect, or feel something deeper, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in honoring quiet strength, consider following for more stories like this where the heroes do not shout, but are never forgotten.